Paterson, New Jersey, located 14 miles from New York, is known as an industrial city that produced locomotives, airplanes, and textiles. It was once called Silk City. From the families who worked in the mills and factories came some of America's finest jazz musicians. In this program, we will meet many of these musicians and listen to their music. Jazz began in New Orleans and traveled to all parts of America. In Paterson, there was the Lido, the Rivoli, Regent, Sandy's Bar, and the Meadowbrook in nearby Cedar Grove. There were school and community bands and orchestras, and many music stores and studios. There were the Dittamos, Salettis, Pete and Bobby Dominic, Teddy and Billy DeMaria, Andy Fitzgerald, Gate Friga, Frank Daly, Joe Mooney, Bucky Pizzarelli, and Lou Costello, who liked to hang out with the musicians. Lots of people were swinging in Paterson.
Bucky.
Yes.
I was just thinking, you and I go back so far, and it all began a few blocks from here for me.
That's
on
right.
Houghton Street. I was born and raised here a little over 75 years ago. They still call me Gate.
I still call you Gabe.
I want you to.
Well, listen, the first time
Father, John,
That's right.
Gate, Friga.
Right. First time I ever heard you play was right down the road here at the 35 Club.
35 Club. You were
Yeah.
10 years old
Yeah,
at the time.
I heard all of you. You and Joe Mooney and Bobby Dominic, Stevie Venora,
Oh, that was great.
Tony Federici.
Ah.
That was
And imagine it right down the road where the Union is.
That's right. That's the Union.
And it all began because of a young, fascinating, charismatic man called Joe
Mooney.
How could we have gone wrong?
We had some great times here, and I still think of this. And in fact, I'd never heard Honeysuckle Rose or Lady Be Good played any better, ever, as I did in this place.
And there it is.
Old Sandy.
Old Sandy's place.
My name is Vince Sandy. My dad was Andrew Sandy, and my mother was Florence. Former owners of Sandy's Hollywood Grill, one of the best, as far as I'm concerned, jazz joints around this area. 1940, we moved into this place where we had numerous jazz groups. Naming some of them, we had Sidney Bechet, Slam Stewart, Vito Musso was here with the group at one time. Also, Freddie Martin Quintet, Estelle Slavin Band, all-girl band, fantastic. Another group was called the Angie Bond Trio, very, very, very good. Red McKinley, and of course, Joe Mooney Quartet. What really made the place famous, you know, as far as music was concerned.
Joe Mooney was born in Paterson in 1911. He was an accordionist, pianist, and composer. He formed many jazz groups and was recognized by jazz critics as one of the finest musicians of the swing era. Fred Dittamo, one of Paterson's most notable musicians and teachers, recalls Mooney.
Well, the importance of Mooney and Sandy's Bar, I think Mooney was 20 years ahead of any jazz musician that was around at the time. And I had associated with him playing a whole season up in Greenwood Lake before he came to Sandy's. And it was really good. It was a real good time that I had with Joe Mooney.
Andy Fitzgerald and Father Gate Friga were members of the original Mooney Quartet. They recall their careers with Mooney.
I ran into Joe Mooney. I met Joe Mooney. I guess it was actually about 1931 or 32, somewhere around there. He used to have jam sessions on Sunday afternoons at a club in Park Avenue here in Paterson. We'd all go up there and listen, and eventually was invited to sit in. I never had such fun in my life. Went into the service when the Great War occurred and spent around 3 years. Came out, went to work with Joe Mooney the night I got out. The night I was discharged, I went to work right in where we're photographing this, in Sandy's bar.
Andy and I go back to the Park Avenue days, where both of us were just filled with Joe Mooney. And we knew that if we wanted to keep playing well, he was the one. And it turned that way. Am I right, Fitz?
That's about it.
Andy Fitzgerald on clarinet, Gate Frege on bass, Jack Hotop on guitar, and Mooney on accordion and piano. They received national acclaim when Downbeat magazine called the Mooney Quartet one of the best jazz ensembles in the nation. They were featured on Paul Whiteman's radio shows and made many records with such hit songs as September Song, Nina Never Knew, and Just a Gigolo.
In '63, I guess it was, just by chance, ended up at a place called The Most in New York, working opposite Joe Mooney. And you can imagine the thrill, because I had listened to Joe in school, and all of a sudden to be working opposite him was just the most extraordinary experience. Joe did some great tunes. One that he did was written by Bing Crosby and Harry Barris, a song that not too many people know. He did From Monday On, I'll be in clover. From Monday on, my cares will be over. Because on Monday, just because it's wash day, you can wash your cares away. From Monday on, things will be different. Don't try to tell me different. And so that was a great song. And the quartet did that one, and they did one written by Sergeant Bilko. It was If I Don't See Her, Each Night I Miss Her. Gee, what a thrill. And of course, that's called Nancy. Sergeant Bilko, Phil Silvers did the lyrics, and Jimmy Van Heusen did the music, I believe is the way it went on that one. And Joe had a big hit on Nina Never Knew with Sorter Finnegan. And by the way, I think while we were at the Most, the writer of Nina Never Knew, Milton Drake, never missed a week, and he was usually in more than once a week, just to sit in the front row and hear Joe sing his song. Girls were made to kiss, but Nina never knew. And, oh, he did, I recorded Nina Never Knew, too. I do a lot of Joe's material.
Mooney moved on, and Sandy's became Howricks. John Napadano, known as Muzzy, is a Paterson jazz musician who recalls those years.
Getting back to Sandy's, which at the time was called Howricks, I had the pleasure of working with some of the great players. Myself, as a youngster, I was only 19 years old, and working on the same stage with Philly Joe Jones and Lee Konitz, who I admire, as well as I admire the rest of the great players, such as Phil Woods, who I think also might have spent some time here in those days. But I know Gulliver's was another place. Amos's place was a magnificent watering hole for the jazz players.
Not far from Sandy's, in Cedar Grove, was Frank Daly's Meadowbrook. It was a mecca for big bands, and many of Paterson's musicians from Local 248 began their careers at the Meadowbrook. Frank Ryerson, Frank Kincaid, Bucky Pizzarelli, and another Jersey boy, Frank Sinatra.
In the early 1920s, my grandfather, William Marks, and my grandmother, Irene Marks, moved to Cedar Grove. They approached the owners of the Fort Towers, which was on Route 23, at that time it was a nightclub, and wanted to purchase it from the owners. They immediately told my grandfather that it was not for sale. My grandfather replied to them that if they wouldn't sell it, he would build a place across the street and put them out of business. And that's exactly what he did. He built the Meadowbrook, at that time known as the Castle Terrace. This is my Uncle Frank's original orchestra. He's standing there with the fiddle. My dad, Cliff, is in the back on the right with the stand-up bass. This was one of the original bands that he had. A gentleman by the name of Joe Mooney, who was a very dear friend of both my father and my uncle, did a lot of the arrangements for that band. All right, this is a shot of the garden terrace at the Meadowbrook. A lot of people don't remember this, and a lot of people were never there. It was only open during the clement weathers. It sat about approximately 500 to 800 people. All the bands played there. And as far as I'm concerned, it was one of the nicest aspects of the Meadowbrook.
Frank Daly's brother, Cliff, himself a musician, ran the Meadowbrook. It seated 1,500 people a night, and a generation of Americans listened and danced to the music of the Dorseys, Tommy and Jimmy, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Stan Kenton, Glenn Miller, and many others. People from the Paterson area held their proms, weddings, and hops at the Meadowbrook. The Meadowbrook ranked with the Glen Island Casino, the Aragon, and Triganon ballrooms. But as World War II came to an end, so did the big band swing room.
A lot of people believe when Glenn Miller died, that was the beginning of the end of the big bands. And I think after the war, the music changed, the swing era came out, big jazz came in, rock and roll was right around the corner, and along with the change in music, so was there a change in the Meadowbrook.
In the 1950s and 1960s, new clubs opened in Paterson. The Kit Kat, La Petite, Cabin of Joy, Three Sisters, and Gulliver's. New people came on the scene: Conrad Brown, Gil Benson, Doug Hawthorne.
I attended my first jazz concert at age 13 at Eastside High School. It was jazz at the Philharmonic, and that there really turned my head around as far as hearing that type music. I studied with Fred Dittamo, a local teacher, Doug Allen, a vibraphone teacher in New York, and Howard Duke Anderson in Belleville, New Jersey, who showed me harmony theory and a sense of well-being to really enjoy the music and to give it what I have. The groups that I have played with have been in Paterson. There was a group called the Four Pieces back in the 60s that included Bernard Taylor, Dick Evans, John Arcata, and myself on vibes, and we did local gigs and had fun.
My first professional job was at the Cabin of Joy on 12th Avenue in Paterson. I'll never forget it. I studied with a local trumpet teacher in Passaic called Mr. Rudolph First, also the legend trumpeter Doc Cheatham, and also Dick Vance. I got a very valuable experience from their teachings. Shortly after my first job, 5 or 6 of the local musicians, we decided to get together and to start a little band. We called ourselves the Royal Swingsters. They consisted of Nate White on piano, Jesse Jackson on bass, Dorsey Hayes on alto, Eddie Generals on drums, and yours truly.
Local 248 of the American Federation of Musicians, located in Paterson, played an important part in the promotion of jazz.
We were never a dual union, and we had blacks in the union during the very early days. They were playing in theaters. They were playing piano, like solo piano in a theater, small theaters. And I remember a few of them that were here. But then when the new era of the 35 and the 36 came in, many of the blacks, young boys, came into the local. And we were never a local to say, you can't belong to the union because you're black.
Local 248 received its charter from the Federation in 1902. And we've been in existence since then. They had some rough years during the 30s where they ran into financial problem. We lost our building. I remember that. I was quite young at the time. And they did rent rooms on Main Street upstairs from where Woolworth's is now. And they were there for a few years until they
got back on our feet financially, and we came back here, and I can say since the leadership of some fine presidents which we had, like Isidore Freeman, Freddie Dittamo, and our president, President Tony Nelia, we're in a position now where we own the building, we have people upstairs that rent the building, we're financially sound, we're one of the soundest locals in the country.
Many of the area jazz musicians were to play in a new club in West Paterson, opened by Amos Kahn.
And we opened up a club in Paterson, in West Paterson, a place that became Gulliver's. And it was probably the club that most people remember. We were there from 70 to 73, and as tough as it was in the Clifton Tap Room, it was that easy in West Paterson. That club, everything clicked. From the day we opened up with a fine local musician, Eddie Hazel, who had already become pretty well known. He was another disciple of Joe Mooney, by the way. Wonderful guitar player and singer, played there quite a bit through the years. And again, I used a lot of the local musicians, the same fellas I used in the Clifton Tap Room.
Gulliver's featured many local musicians, such as John Firencelli, a fine piano jazz player and a beloved local teacher. There was also Tommy Iannelli, better known as Buddy Neal, another Paterson jazz great and a local teacher. The big names also came to Gulliver's: Bobby Brookmeyer, Zoot Sims, Toots Thielman, Jim Hall, Art Farmer, and many others. Like the city of Paterson, jazz also changed after the 1960s. More and more jazz musicians were studying informal jazz studies programs. Such a program is offered at William Paterson College, only a few blocks away from downtown Paterson. Here, Rufus Reed, the musical director, works with young musicians.
The Wpc Jazz Program goes back to about 1965. That is, if you want to call what we did at that time a jazz program. We just started out with a big band, and there weren't very many of those in colleges. We called it a jazz ensemble, not a stage band. That was what was pretty common. And during those first years, we immediately started to bring in some wonderful soloists to play with the band. People like Jimmy Hall, Donald Byrd. I almost shake my head when I think what we paid those people back in those days. I'd like to be able to drop a check and pay them a little more right now. But we had some good times in those days, and the program actually flowered because a lot of students were interested in jazz. They almost forced us to have a more bona fide program when that was a degree. That actually happened in 1973. The year before that, we brought Thad Jones on the faculty, and he was the first full-time jazz instructor. And then Rufus Reed came on the scene. Rufus was a great educator, great performer, and once again, a year after Rufus arrived on the scene, we came up with a Bachelor of Music program, which was really a lot more realistic for what we were doing. And with Rufus, just about that time, things really started to cook.
William Paterson College conferred honorary doctorate degrees on Thad Jones and Benny Golson, two of the great jazz musicians who taught in the college's jazz studies program.
This is a great time for a young jazz musician to be on the scene, too. There's a lot more happening in jazz, and there's a lot more respect nationwide. If you're a young jazz musician today, you have a very good chance, if you're 20 years old, of coming out and getting a record contract, and with a very good label. There's actually a wealth of jazz talent living in Paterson. People wouldn't ordinarily realize it, but since it's only 14 miles from New York, the jazz mecca of the world, it's not too surprising. New York's gotten so expensive that actually very few musicians can live in Manhattan, or less than you'd think. They might live in Brooklyn. A lot live in Paterson, though. There's people like Kenny Bowles from the Illinois Jaquette Big Band, and Adam Brenner, who I've seen with Lionel Hampton and with Mel Torme and so on, and Frank Jolliffe and Willie Dalton, and I could mention more.
Joe Mooney died in 1975. his musical legacy lives on in the music he wrote and performed. For the 200th anniversary of the city of Paterson in 1993, there was a revival of the Joe Mooney Quartet with two of its original members, Andy Fitzgerald and Father Gate Friga, joined by Bucky Pizzarelli, Gene Favatella, and Jerry Bruno.
Everywhere I go, people know the part I'm playing.
Local 248 of the American Federation of Musicians presents jazz concerts in the parks. The Paterson Museum at the old Rogers Locomotive Factory features young jazz musicians. The old clubs, dance halls, and theaters are gone, but jazz remains alive and well in Paterson.
We had some great times here.
I never had such fun in my life.